Okay, welcome back to Thrive in the Future. This week I have Jason Snyder with me. Welcome, Jason.
Nice to be here again. Good to see you.
Yeah,
Good to see you, Scott.
it's good to see you. So, give a little background for some of the folks who may not have seen you on the previous episodes.
Background, well, I live in the high country of North Carolina. That's as precise as I'll get. But I guess most immediately relevant is we just had Hurricane Helene kind of, ravage our whole region. Um, I have, I'm kind of developing a homestead at our place, and a little bit of a setback there. Our house is okay, but our field became a river. Um, the damages weren't too large, I would say. Our driveway got washed out. A bunch of our trees, I mean, they just completely like got knocked over. I had to like lift them up, and a lot of the fencing was washed away. Our garden was flooded, so everything in the garden was basically couldn't use anymore because the water wasn't very clean. Um, I don't know if I've jumped too specifically into like what's been on my mind. Broader background. I have a background in, I don't know, I've done all kinds of things. I've taught at the university. I've done like research and analysis. I've done landscaping type work. So I've just done all kinds of things. But in general, one of the co-founders of Doomer Optimism, and we're interested in, um, despite all of the huge challenges we face as people in this age, how can we carve out ways to be optimistic? So that's what we try and focus on.
That's great. Yeah, so we jumped into the hurricane, but that's what I wanted to talk about is how to
Mm.
stay optimistic and then recover regeneratively from that. So, what was it like riding it out?
Well, it was surprising. We've had, hurricanes come up in the past, and usually we just get a good rain. And so
Mhm.
probably a week before that, I thought that would be the same thing. The Wednesday before the main hurricane, we woke up in the morning and it was clear that the water had, kind of like gone through our field in certain spots, and certain parts of our driveway were washed out, but the water was still basically the creek was still basically in its course. And so we are like, wow, that's surprising. We weren't expecting that. And oh, it's going to get worse. So suddenly, like the alarm bells went off, right? Um, so that day we went and got some more supplies, provisions. Um, and then the day of, I mean, like we weren't too worried about our physical safety. We're kind of, our most of our land is in a floodplain, but our house is up on a hill that's
Mhm.
pretty high, and so we weren't worried too much about our house flooding, maybe the basement. Slightly worried about landslides because our hill was right behind us, but there's a lot of vegetation on it. It's not too steep, so I wasn't um, super worried about that. But when the day arrived, when we woke up and we look outside, and there's just a giant river, looks like one of like the River Ganges or something, and just a huge, one of these famous rivers, the Mississippi, whatever, right? Like
Yeah.
going through where your field usually is. We're like, okay, well, I mean, at a certain point you just realize, this is, like we're pretty feeble creatures here, right? Nature, or God, or whatever the larger forces are, they're much bigger than us. And so we knew already, okay, there goes our driveway. We're gonna have some various damages. But the day of, I mean, we were just sitting inside most of the day, looking out our window at, propane tanks floating by,
Wow.
just, large, just items of all sorts, from that's washed away from other people's properties going by. And, we couldn't go anywhere. We lost power, lost network and internet. We did have our neighbor who we could, walk over and talk to. And we're pretty good friends with our neighbors, so um, it's not like we're like all alone, but we're like, wow, yeah, we're pretty cut off here. Like we can't cross this raging river. We can't call anybody. We can't do any of that. So we're just gonna have to figure it out. And it was a pretty pretty surreal kind of day, I have to
Hmm.
say.
Yeah, and then so did you get a lot of wind or anything like that, or it was mainly a rain event?
It wasn't super windy at our house. I think where we're situated, there's some mountains, kind of, uh, facing the direction that the wind was coming from. So the wind wasn't actually that bad. Like none of our real tree branches, like large trees near our house, broke off or anything like that. Like you could go outside and, sometimes there'd be like a wind gust, but it wasn't like you go outside and you're in danger of being knocked over. So it was really, other areas the wind was much worse. I mean, a lot of trees in a lot of parts of the region just like fell over and you can just see like trees, part of it was the ground being so saturated because
Sure.
it'd been raining for several days before that, unrelatedly, and so the
Hmm.
ground was already saturated when the storm came. So a lot of the trees, the wind and the saturation of the soil knocked them over. But where we were, it was just the water. Again, like we're, most of it is a floodplain, and so I finally, saw what that meant. We had heard about, like people talked about like the 1916 flood, right, being like a big deal in the region. And I've, read histories of that and the 1940 flood. And this was on par with those. This was actually probably a bit worse than each of those. More like a, 200 to people have said up to 1,000 years. Some people have said up to a 10,000 year kind of flood.
Hmm.
So it was mostly the water that, was, uh, the most salient for us at that point.
Wow. So do you have a source of water? It didn't get messed up or anything? I mean, you're not like on
Well,
well
so
water
we're
or...
on a, we're on a well and it's
Hmm.
electric pump. Uh, I thought about it before, but I'm now more interested in getting a hand pump after this. I mean, we had stored up a little bit of water.
Hmm.
We knew we were probably going to lose power, so we had filled up containers and stuff. We also have a rain barrel, which can't drink directly out of, but you can treat it.
Sure.
We also have a little spring as well. So for the first couple days, we were basically depending on all of those, right? We were like boiling spring water for tea and using rain barrels for washing dishes and filling up the toilet so we could flush it, that kind of stuff.
Hmm.
But after even by the end of that day, um, and the next day we couldn't drive out because our driveway was completely washed out. But we had friends come by to check on us and bring us stuff, and we were able to kind of like our bridge held, our creek bridge held, and a lot of people's creek bridges didn't hold. So that was really we were very fortunate that our creek,
Hmm.
if that hadn't held, then we'd be in a very different situation. Um, so, we were able to like borrow a friend's car and get rides with people to even the next day, like go into town and get the, supplies we needed and stuff. So, um, yeah, um, I never felt at any point that like, oh, we're in serious danger here. Uh,
Oh, okay.
yeah. So, I mean, again, we're fortunate. A lot of people died in the storm.
Sure.
People, who, we live along like a major highway. Um, so, we got, like even in the afternoon after the storm had subsided, there were already starting people drive and getting turned around because it was the road was kind of cut off. But pretty soon, like we weren't way up in the hollers, so to speak. With a lot of people, their creek bridge did break, and they were just completely cut off. And so for a lot of those folks, I think even up till now, their situations were much, much more dire and
Hmm.
just dangerous in terms of, human life.
Sure. So how long did it take for the water to come down?
I mean, the high point was around noon.
Hmm.
It started getting to the point where we can actually kind of like get to our bridge because our driveway is pretty long. We share it with a couple neighbors. The driveway is pretty long. Probably by late afternoon, we were able to kind of like walk through the water. Like there was still like more rivulets, I guess, and we were able to kind of walk through those and get to the bridge. kind of thing. But our, there's all also our bridge was blocked for a while because there was just tons of junk that built up on it, and so we had to like the next day clear my neighbor and I cleared that off,
Hmm.
just all of the junk and branches and everything, stuff like that. Um, so yeah, I mean, and by the next day, it was basically, we had like standing water in various places, but there was no more river.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah, I saw the video and just the biblical flood, plant
Yeah.
trees, cultivate gardens, raise
Yeah.
livestock.
And, and in this particular case, I mean, again, I think most of our trees are going to survive.
Hmm.
We lost probably several like small saplings that we had planted that just got buried with like mud or, our part of our driveway blowing out is a lot of like just gravel and sand and river rocks washed into our field. So
Sure.
still needed to clean that up. And so a lot of things just got buried. But most of the trees, I just had to kind of lift them up, get all the gunk off of them. So in some cases, kind of, prop them up with something. Um,
Hmm.
and they were still alive. We'll see. They were definitely damaged. Um, and so, we'll see if they make it through the winter. But then, we have our chicken coop. Our chicken coop is on stilts. It's near the house where the water did get to, but it didn't get very high. So, the chickens were just hanging out in the coop. Yeah, and then our garden, basically, we lost, you know, some like end of year crops that, we're not going to eat because it's, the water is pretty polluted. Um,
Sure.
but and some of our garden fencing and chicken run fencing got damaged, had to fix that. But so it did directly impact those three things that I talk about in that tweet. But it's like, well, now we're aware that this can happen. Um, but we're just going to keep we're going to rebuild what was damaged, and then we're just going to keep building because that's what we do.
Yeah. So do you have um a bunch of creek bottom new soil in your pasture in your field now that you're going to be able to you're going to have all this great soil now, or is it did it wash everything away?
Well, the bottomlands, people talk about the bottomlands here are the most fertile because
Hmm.
historically you do get this occasional flooding and it brings in all of the soil and silt and deposits it. And so we
Sure.
probably, I'm sure, got some of that. So as a fertilization. Of course, historically you didn't have, industrial pollutants also being mixed
Yeah.
into that, right?
Hmm.
A lot of various industrial pollutants, petroleum products, all kinds of things that
You
also probably
said
got.
propane tank was floating down the river.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, we probably saw like half a dozen propane tanks, just like large propane tanks, like just like floating down the river. So we'll see what the net, what the net effect of that is on soil fertility
Hmm.
for our pasture. Next year we're hoping to get sheep, and so I'm hoping that the grass does come back, and it's not. It seems okay. Like the grass that didn't get covered with, silt and rocks, looks pretty healthy at this point. So pretty optimistic about that.
Yeah, good, because that was a month ago, right? So some of it's probably
Yeah.
bounced back a little bit before you haven't got have you got your frost yet?
We
Your
have we
first
have
frost?
gotten some frost. Yeah, it got really cold like 3 weeks after the storm. It was getting down into the 30s. Um, but it's since warmed up again. But yeah, I mean, you know, a lot of again, like looking at our, trees, like we have a lot of chestnut trees and apple trees and just various fruit and nut, and they definitely look damaged. Like a lot of the leaves had either got washed off or they're looking very you know, kind of dead at that point. But the way I figured it is, well, they were going to fall off soon anyway. And so as
Right.
long as the tree survives, it's probably not that big of a deal in terms of getting the energy that it needs to sustain itself, right? Um,
Hmm.
so the big test again will be to see, how they fare over winter and how they rebound in the spring. That'll be
Right.
very interesting to see. Yeah.
How many nut trees do you have now?
Oh gosh. I mean, we have probably upwards of 15 to 20 chestnuts.
Wow.
We had just planted a bunch of hickory, shagbark hickory, and those were tiny. We had planted them from seed in the last fall, and we had about 10 of those coming up. That most of those got buried. Um, we have we had like 35 hazelnuts or so.
Mm-hmm.
35 or 40, I can't remember. Um, we lost probably five of those, I would say. And a few more are like not looking great, but they seem
Mm-hmm.
to still be alive. So yeah, um, it would be, it would be a real shame if they didn't bounce back, but I think they will.
Mm-hmm. Well, good. At least they didn't all wash away, right?
Yeah, and I just planted five heart nut trees. I've heard that those are the Japanese walnut. I heard those produce relatively quickly for nut trees.
Mm-hmm.
So it felt good to like, after the storm, almost as a symbolic gesture, like, keep planting, right? Don't just recover, but like do something new, right? So,
Right.
more for the psychological benefit of doing that, of like, look, we're still making progress, even though we had a setback.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I've got to get some of those hard nut trees. They sound really good. Yeah, and the hickory I've grown for 2 years and they're still only like 4 inches, 6 inches
Yeah,
tall.
yeah, that's definitely, you're doing that for your kids and grandkids kind
Yeah.
of situation for
I
sure.
think they 10 plus years before they bear their first nut.
Right.
So,
And I've heard it's 40 years before they reach peak production.
right.
Yeah. That's, I mean, once you get into those timelines, you're like, okay, well, I might have one bumper harvest and then I'll croak the next day kind of thing, but it's okay. Next generation will enjoy.
Well,
Yeah.
that's what we're doing, planting for the future generations anyway, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
That's
Yeah.
good. So what else are you doing from a regenerative standpoint to rebuild to what would you do differently
What
that
would
you
I do
haven't talked about already?
differently now that I know that this kind of thing is real, that it can
Hmm.
happen? Um, I mean, so one, I mean, it was more my dad who was wanting us to like build little cabins out in the field. We're like, I'm glad we didn't do that. Um, because they would have probably gotten washed away unless we put them, unless we put them on like 10-foot high stilts or something, and thick layer, in a thick layer of concrete kind of thing.
Hmm.
But differently. I mean, I'm pretty glad where our garden was because it wasn't in like the thick of the flooding. And so just spacing of things, I don't think I would really change things. Um, I mean, I think differently, it's more of, what's happening in the larger community, right? So, on the one hand, there's just been so much, outpouring of like people just serving other people. Um, just the first few days, everybody was checking on each other. Everybody was making sure that, everybody they knew was okay. People were helping each other out in various ways. And so I think just and people, I guess, life slowed down a lot, right? Like
Right,
a lot of people didn't, unless you're like, a lineman or, in a trade that you're in immediate disaster recovery, like a lot of people weren't working. Um, so, people had time to just kind of like visit each other, chat, take their time, um, relate to each other, empathize with each other with their situation. And
right,
so regeneratively, I think, the best thing coming out of this is I think just the connections that are made out of this, right? Like we as a, community have gone through something together and we support each other. And, there was no, there was there was not really anybody who was like trying to take advantage of the situation, at least people that we know, like
Hmm.
or like so I just think that in terms of culture, our culture is going to greatly benefit from this event. It's unfortunate that it requires these kinds of events for that to occur, but that's one big thing. On the other hand, there's this new threat of, what people call disaster capitalism, where, the vultures are circling around seeing like, okay, how can we take advantage of the situation, right?
Yeah.
Financially. And so there's, been reports of a lot of people, like even in the first few days after the flood, like getting te unsolicited text messages basically saying, hey, are you interested in selling your house? Presumably because you had a lot of damages and you can't afford to fix them. So, hey, we'll take it off your hands, right?
Yeah.
That kind of thing. Um, but on the other hand, there's already a lot of kind of community mobilization, um, recognizing that and trying to figure out how to prevent that.
Hmm.
So, just a few days ago, I went to a community event, a grassroots organization that, was basically that was the topic of like, how do we rebuild in a way that benefits the locals, right? Not in a way that benefits, um, you know, the the gentrifiers, the second homeowners, the investors, the speculators, all of that. And so I think a lot of the, potential threats, but in reaction to those threats, the regenerative potential is on a cultural level, and us really trying to define, what do we really value about this place, and what direction do we want it to go? Because without intentionality behind that, it could just, lead in a direction that is not regenerative.
Hmm. Yeah, when you were just before you said culture, I was thinking, yeah, this is a culture building event, right? You
Yeah.
have you have space, you have that slack time like David Fleming and Sean talk about in Surviving the Future, right?
Yeah.
And that breathing, that
Yeah.
that space. I'd like to see a lot more of that in
Yeah.
regular life,
Yeah.
in the cycles and stuff.
Absolutely. Um, and in terms of resilience, I think that we're going to be much more resilient in general. Like, a lot more people are going to have generators, right? A
Hmm.
lot more people are going to have water barrels. A lot more people are going to have Starlink or something, so they can get internet when everything else goes down. A lot more people are probably going to store away food and water and fuel. So I think it was definitely a wake up call because, part of the larger narrative in this place was like, oh, we're pretty safe. We don't really have natural disasters, right? Like forest fires aren't a huge deal because we get lots of water. But hurricanes aren't a big deal because we have the mountains that run interference and break it up. Tornadoes aren't, don't really happen here. So we were like, hey, we're saying pretty here, right? Like climate change, it's not going to affect us very much, whatever, right? Whatever it happens to be. And so this was kind of a wake-up call that's like, actually, you know, we're vulnerable in a very specific way. So I think people might think twice about building certain ways in floodplains, for example. People might think twice about allowing, developments on top of, like million-dollar mansion developments on top of mountains that decrease the absorption capacity of the water so that it ends up flooding in the bottomlands, right?
Sure.
People might think twice about um, planting various invasive species that don't have deep root structures and can't absorb water very well, and lead to more landslides by having it there. And so I think, you know, a lot of us will be thinking about, okay, like how can we boost our riparian areas, right? Like how can we plant more trees and stuff along riparian areas that absorbs at least some of the water when it, pushes over the bank, kind of thing.
Hmm.
Um, so yeah, in that way, like, we're just going to be much more aware of like how we build. You build a barn. Maybe you don't want to build it in a floodplain, right? Maybe build it up on a foothill or something. So things of that nature, um, uh, we're going to be in a better position next time for sure.
Hmm. Yeah, that sounds great. So one of the things, like when power goes out, reportedly the cell phone towers only have a few days of batteries, and then somebody actually has to
Mm,
go out and touch them and turn them, turn them back on and stuff. What
mm.
was it like being without comms for that long?
Yeah. Again, it wasn't too bad for us because we could get into town and the
Hmm.
comms were put back in town pretty quickly.
Okay.
So we're near a town of about 30,000 people or something. About 10 miles away from that. And
Yeah.
and so the comms there was restored pretty quickly. So like once a day, or once, every couple of days or something, we could make a trip into town, do all of our communications for half an hour or something, or an hour, and then get back to it. But so we weren't we weren't cut off from the world. Um, on the other hand, in some ways, it was very nice, right? Like we went to bed a lot earlier because when it got dark, we didn't have screens that we could, sink into for a while to distract ourselves. We weren't on social media all the time. We weren't really paying that much attention to the national news situation, and all of that was frankly a relief. Um, to be, one kind of a bit immune from all of those things, and two, having to focus on very tangible things in your life. So like, oh, we want to cook dinner. Well, we have an electric stove. We can't do that. Well, okay, we do have wood. We do have a wood fire stove, so let's cook on the stove, right? And that was just very, a nice change of a nice change of pace. Um, or other people would barbecue, right? And we didn't really do this. We were thinking about it, but then our power turned back on of like, so a lot of people, have stored meat in their freezers. They don't have electricity or they don't have a generator starting to de-thaw. So a lot of people were just having like barbecue parties and stuff. We're like, well, it's all
Hmm.
going bad anyway, so we might as well just invite a bunch of people over and, cook up a bunch of meat and have like an event kind of thing. Um, so that, that's so there was just a lot of in many ways there was a lot of benefits of just slowing down, um, not taking the tangible things for granted. Um, oh, we just cooked dinner on the wood stove. Now we have to wash dishes. Well, the sink, the well pump doesn't work, so we can't use the sink. Well, we got to go outside and use our rain barrel, right? And it's just a
Hmm.
very different set of experiences to, not take these basic things for granted. And,
Right.
when the power came back on, of course, I was relieved, but a part of me was also like, a little bit uh, not saddened, but it was just kind of like, oh, okay, well, I guess we're gonna get back to modern life again. And in some ways, it's you know a little bit unfortunate.
Yeah, you escaped modernity for a week, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yep.
Well, that's great. So plant trees, cultivate gardens, and raise livestock. And,
Right. And be
and
careful what you do in floodplains. Yeah.
that's great. Thank you, Jason.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for inviting me on.
You bet. I like it. A different story that you don't hear from other folks.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, first time I've had this kind of story.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely.